Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Desiree Rover from the Netherlands. I'm a medical research journalist and I delve into all sorts of subjects and find very intriguing guests for you. And tonight is not an exception. I have for you Nicholas Kardaris. Hi, Nicholas. Welcome.
Hi. Pleasure to be here and thank you for having me.
Yes, well, Nicholas, you are a professor. You have taught at the university different things, neuropsychology and stuff like that. But there is a whole different part of you in your past. You were a karate champion.
Yes, I was an AAU karate champion back in 1986, a very long time ago.
Yeah, well, nevertheless, it's in your history.
Yes.
And you are a recovering New York City nightclub owner and a coma survivor. If you write your biography, people say, oh, don't exaggerate, please.
Yes, it was the signs of my misspent youth. Yes, when I was a younger man, I went to a nice Ivy League school and I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and I sort of drifted into the world of nightlife and entertainment. And in that world, as many of your viewers might know, there's some candy that people can get addicted to, and I developed some bad habits as a young man that led to a pretty severe addiction, which led me to almost wind up dying. And I was in a coma for a couple of weeks. And it was actually emerging from that experience that my life transformed, that I wound up going back to university, getting my master's degree, my PhD, and becoming Dr. Kardaris with a focus on addiction and helping people that were struggling from different kinds of addictive disorders to get back on track in their lives and to save their lives. So my Siddhartha-like journey, I'd like to believe helped create the man that I am today, which I'd like to think is a person of service and a life of purpose.
Yes, I recognize what you're saying. My story is different, but the reason why I do what I do has a reason also. That was a total turnaround in my life.
Right.
I lost a son to the chemotherapy that he got for a cancer that came from vaccines. That's a short version. And so I'm helping people to understand why vaccination is not such a good idea and what you can do to be healthy. And basically that is what you're doing as well, but then in another arena, so to speak.
Well, and my wife went through chemotherapy about 4 years ago and had her own health scares, and we come from a very holistic perspective, and the whole both treatment community and I think illness model in the world is, I think it's very eye-opening. Whenever somebody has an existential crisis, either going through any kind of illness or any kind of potentially transformative experience, it will, like Nietzsche said, it will either destroy you or make you stronger. And it sounds like you were made stronger for that experience. I like to think I was, but it's also fairly eye-opening for the paradigms that are out there that maybe keep us sick, maybe keep us in a toxic situation.
Yeah, exactly. When certain things happen in your life, I always compare it with chickens. When there are chickens in a pasture and you run into them, then two things happen. One part of the chickens go sit and look, I'm not here. And the other one like, well, we are the part.
Right. Yeah.
We raise our voices and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not okay. Yeah.
And I think that's sort of what I'm trying to raise awareness about the topic that we're going to talk about today. It's a situation where I think as a species we have been globally impacted there's a situation, and of course we're talking about the digital age and screens and how they've impacted us developmentally, neurologically, psychologically, emotionally, and yet none of these devices were ever vetted in any sort of meaningful way before our society underwent a seismic shift and we started exposing, literally newborns to these very hyper stimulating, neurologically impacting devices, and society seemed to be pretty oblivious to it. For the most part, people just assumed, well, this is the way things are now. And people are beginning to raise a red flag now, beginning to say, wait a second, why have we let this digital Trojan horse into our homes and without asking any questions? And I just want to preface it by saying that I'm not a Luddite. I'm not obviously anti-technology. You and I have the pleasure of communicating across the world today as a byproduct of technology. And I often analogize it to something like an automobile. Cars are wonderful. I think I love my automobile, but I don't think my 8-year-old should be driving it. There's this idea of age-appropriate technology, and what we unfortunately haven't done is we haven't screened the screens or vetted the screens for age appropriateness. And we're somebody like myself who works as a psychologist, in addition to being a professor, and I run a rehab. I've worked with over 1,000 young people over the last 13, 14 years, and I've been on the front lines of some of the clinical impacts that young people have suffered through by being overexposed to screens.
Yeah, I think also in that sense, it's an individual difference. One person will react differently than the next, and one person will be really addicted and his brain architecture will have changed, and that is bothersome, while with another person, that's more easy to stop doing it, so to speak. But I have seen with a little boy with friends of mine in Oslo. He was 6 years old and he had a sister of 4 years old, and he was very nice with his sister until he had played on his computer game. Then he was awful, like a switch. Amazing.
Well, and that's why I got a lot of recognition. I wrote a few articles for Scientific American and for Time Magazine where I analogized the screens as a digital drug. And what we have discovered, what the research is showing, is that they affect the brain in exactly the same way as a substance, an addictive substance can. And people are shocked to hear that, but the research is quite clear that the brain impacts, especially the frontal cortex, which is the part of our brain behind our foreheads, which is the executive functioning parts of our brain, get impacted exactly the same way as substance addiction impacts us. And you're correct in saying that not everybody gets impacted the same way. Every child who is exposed to screens for certain periods of time does get impacted. Now, whether it's a slight attentional impact where it impacts their ability to focus, it might impact their mood, it might impact as you mentioned, the potential for an addiction. We know that about 10% of the population is predisposed to having an addictive issue with either behavior or substances. And those underlying vulnerabilities are magnified in the digital age. So if a child has certain emotional or psychological vulnerabilities that are pre-existing, when you expose them to screen technologies, the impacts are potentially much worse. But even healthy, well-adjusted kids are developmentally impacted. It's just less obvious in those cases.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the youngsters of today have so many more challenges than we had, or I had. And I see that it is very difficult. And I see that the parents of babies today, I saw it in my own family. There was this 2-year-old, and he woke up in the night while I was babysitting, and I saw that his mother wasn't there. And then, you know what he asked for? The iPad.
The iPad. Of course.
I thought, what's going on here?
Right. What's going on here? I think you're exactly right. It's always been difficult going from childhood to young adulthood. Adolescence has always been a difficult transitional period
Yeah.
where the transition from being a child into then being acclimated into the larger society, that rite of passage that we used to call teenagehood was always difficult. And you had things like bullying and cliques and depression and substance abuse to that some kids used to escape to that couldn't handle that transition.
Mm-hmm.
What we're seeing in the digital age is that the digital age is amplifying some of those tendencies. So when 20 years ago we had bullying and five teenagers might bully one teenager, now we have 5,000 teenagers can bully
Yeah.
one person because cyberbullying amplifies everything. If you make a mistake in high school now, it's not just your 5 or 6 friends that are going to tease you. Now it could be a YouTube video that goes viral, and now all of a sudden you're going to be shamed and humiliated in front of 50,000 students. There's a reason why the adolescent, teenage, female adolescent suicides have tripled in the last 10 years.
Oh God.
There's a reason for that, and I don't think it's by accident that a lot of these increasing clinical disorders have significantly increased with the increase of screen time. ADHD rates are up 50% over the last 10 years. We know that screens affect developmentally children's ability to pay attention, to focus, because they're getting hyper-stimulated and then they need to keep getting stimulated to be able to focus. We know that mood disorders like depression have increased exponentially over the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I first became aware of this problem about 10 years ago when I had a 16-year-old student was referred to my practice, to my office, and they had been playing a game called World of Warcraft for 10 hours a night. And when they got sent to my office, they were in a state of full-blown video game psychosis. They didn't know what was real and what I wrote about that in my book, Glow Kids. That was my first aha moment where this young man was blinking his eyes and said, "Are we still in the game? Is this the game?" And he had to go to a psychiatric hospital for 1 month to re-tether himself to reality. And so these games, I realized, were having a pretty powerful psychological impact on young people, and yet most people weren't even aware of the potential for some of these effects.
Does it have to do with the fact that the frontal cortex is not full grown yet when until you're 25 years old?
Well, yes. So that has to do with the fact that young people can be more potentially addicted because the frontal cortex controls our impulsivity. So young people do things, are more impulsive. They're not able to what we call consequentially think as much. So a 17-year-old, that's why 17-year-olds have unprotected sex. They ride bicycles without helmets. They don't think of the consequences and part of the executive functioning. So young people tend to be more impulsive. The problem is because the brain is still developing, there are certain developmental windows that a child goes through, like language. Learning a language is a developmental window. And as we know, if you don't learn the language during a certain period of your childhood, it becomes almost impossible or very difficult to learn language as you get older. So attention is also a developmental window. If during the time of your childhood, usually the age is between 2 and 8, when you're developing your sense of focus and your sense of also what we call reality testing, what's real. The child begins to realize I'm real, you're real, when they get to be about 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. If during that time we're exposing them to hyper-realistic 52-inch screen video games that blur reality, they haven't developed their sense of what's real yet. So for them, is the game real? Is their mother real? Am I real? It becomes very confusing for them. So the psychotic effects are one aspect of it. The attentional effects, the ADHD effect, are another part of it. And the addiction effects are yet another part of it. So it's a complex array of clinical issues that arise.
Yeah. I wanted to ask something about children that, the brain does not make a difference between what they see on a movie, on a screen, or in reality. So you take it all in. Kids with that office manager that's not there yet,
Right. Right.
they cannot make the difference. So in that sense, it's garbage in, garbage out. And what I see is that those games, those video games, are violent. They are negative.
Right.
There is nothing really educational about it.
And that's the great lie. So the great scam, the con that we've been dealt as a society is that, look, every parent, I think, wants what's best for their children, or at least most parents want what's best for their children. So I don't think parents knowingly would give their children something that they thought was dangerous or negatively impacting their development. But what the lie has been is that they're educational. And so the technology companies, Microsoft, Apple, Google, have fed this false narrative that screens and technology is educational. And so when a parent, let's face it, I have 9-year-old twins. It's challenging raising young children. It's much easier to put the child in front of what we call the digital babysitter because we know the child quiets down because of the hypnotic effect of the screen.
Yes.
And the parent then reassures themselves by saying, well, at least it's educational. But the reality is, and I've talked to hundreds of principals and school administrators and superintendents, and you ask them, show me one research study that shows that screens are educational. And you get various versions of humana, 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 There is not one study that shows that a child who has an iPad in kindergarten or first grade has better educational outcomes in high school or college. There's no research that shows that. And yet, for the last 10 years, schools have made a very conscious decision, especially here in the United States, billions of dollars have been spent on what's called education technology. Globally, it's a $60 billion a year global industry. And yet there's not one stitch of research that shows that these things are educationally effective. And yet what the research is showing is they're clinically damaging. And it'd be one thing if they were just ineffective. You know, if schools want to waste money on ineffective teaching methods, that's one thing. But they're spending money not only on ineffective teaching methods, but on potentially damaging teaching methods.
Yeah, and in schools you have the Wi-Fi that is also brain bending, so to speak. It's dangerous.
Well, you have the EMF, the radiation effects, but schools here in the United States are giving tablets to younger and younger. 10 years ago, it used to be high school kids were getting tablets, and now a lot of schools, there's a movement, at least here in the United States, to give iPads to 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds. And what we're beginning to see is that it's the most age-inappropriate developmentally thing you can do. The best thing that a 5 or a 6-year-old can do developmentally is to be bored and to use their active imagination to create and play with other children. That's what builds their neurosynaptic muscles. When we program imagery into a child's brain, they no longer have to create their own imagery. The child loses their ability to have an imagination. And we know that that's one of the most powerful things that a child needs to be developing, their own imagination. When the child reads a book, they're creating interior mental imagery of that, what they're reading. But when you show the child that imagery, you're programming the child. And now the child no longer has to create the imagery. It makes the brain lazy, and it makes the brain dependent on that imagery. And that's what we're doing. We're creating a whole generation of children who now no longer have the ability to create or to use their minds. There's a study now that has showed that children can no longer play with blocks. Kids who were raised on iPads from the ages of 18 months to 5 years of age, in one study, they weren't able to build with building blocks, which used to be the most fundamental thing that children could do. That's what we're doing to our kids.
Oh, yeah, that is dumbing down on steroids.
Exactly. We're dumbing down our kids under the false narrative that we're giving them a leg up on our technological world. We're educating them. We're getting them to be digital savvy. And what I point out to people is Sergey Brin and Larry Page, who invented Google, they were Montessori students. They didn't have technology until they were 12 or 13. Steve Jobs didn't give his children iPads. that was a New York Times interview a few years ago in 2010. He said, he doesn't give his children iPads. They talk at the dinner table. They talk about history and culture, and they don't have technology at their dinner table. The founder of eBay, the most influential leaders in technology, never had technology as children. Their brains developed, and then they were able to be innovators in technology. Kids are getting exposed to technology too young of an age right now, and I've worked with a lot of them. They have this flat personality, and I call them uninteresting and uninterested. They are these children that say, stimulate me. I just need to be stimulated. And yet they have no curiosity, no sense of wonder about the world, because that's what we've robbed them of by constantly stimulating them with these screen devices.
Yeah, with ready-made stuff that they don't have to work with themselves. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's very serious. I'm very worried because I see in teens now that they don't have a clue how to think.
Right.
I hear parroting. They parrot what they have heard, and they speak in multiple choice, so to speak.
You know, it's interesting. There's a sedating effect to screens, the hypnotic sedating effect. Neil Postman.
Alpha waves?
Well, you know, I think it could do with the alpha waves. I think the blue light of the radiant screen also, but it's like the hypnotic circle. It pulls a person in, and it has that. Let's face it, when we've seen children on screens, the world could be ending around them, and they're so hypnotically focused on the screen. And I think that has a political context as well. Neil Postman, Dr. Postman, had been an New York University professor back in the 1980s. And in 1985, Dr. Postman wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And in 1985, before the iPad, before interactive screens, back in the days of television, Neil Postman said he analogized the screen to Brave New World and Soma. And that back in Brave New World, the masses were sedated by this narcotic called Soma. And there was a political context to Soma, because if you were high on Soma, you didn't care about who was president or prime minister or what was happening on around you. You just cared about that. And what we're seeing is that the kids that I've worked with who have been raised on screens since they were younger, they can't tell me who the president is. They can't tell you what's going on in Europe. They only know what's going on in their screen world. And it has a very anesthetizing, dampening down effect. What I can tell you as an addictions expert, in the United States in the times of slavery in the 1800s, the slave owners used to give slaves every Saturday, the male slaves used to get a bottle of moonshine. You know, moonshine is that homemade alcohol.
Yeah.
And they didn't give the slaves that as a reward. They gave slaves a bottle of moonshine because they knew that a drunk slave wouldn't educate themselves, wouldn't know what was happening politically, and wouldn't escape. Similarly, in the 1960s and 70s, when there was the Vietnam War, the heroin epidemic, and then in the 1980s, the crack epidemic, some of these drugs have the effect of keeping whole populations sedated and compromised. What I think when I see this whole generation getting drunk on technology, there's a sedating effect where young people are not as involved or aware of what's happening geopolitically, whether it's by design or whether it's by accident, but that's the byproduct of it.
Yes. Yeah. They have no clue what's going on. Yeah. And as I said, they can't think for themselves. There was a little video of two Belgian boys, so 16, 17 years old. They had crazy questions, and they asked them, they posed these questions to girls their own age. And it was something like, what is the higher tone, an alloctone or an autochtone? And these girls did never ask themselves, what is an alloctone, what is an autochtone? It doesn't have anything to do with music, so what's the question here? No, they only tried to choose between those two words, and they had a whole series of these things. It was hilarious on one hand, but very worrisome on the other.
Yeah. It's not, before you talked about the aggression effect and how we're getting desensitized, we've not only been desensitized to aggression and to, I think, stimulating content, but
Yeah.
our senses have been desensitized as well. They did in Germany at Joseph Chilton Pierce is a pretty legendary
Magical Child.
magical
Yeah.
child.
Beautiful book. Yeah.
And he also wrote the Biology of Transcendence, and he talked about research out of Germany where they were studying, this is starting back in the late 1950s, university professors were noticing that each cohort, each year, students seemed to be able to not hear and see color as well, that they were getting desensitized. This is after television first came out. And they did a study over the course of the next 30 years, and they found that every year our sensory acuity was going down 1%. And that back in the 1950s, people were able to discern roughly 300 shades of a color, 300 shades of the color red, for example. And then by the 1980s, that was about 125 shades of red. And by the 2000s, we're down to about 50 shades of red. And the same thing with sound. We're less sensory acute now in terms of what we're able to perceive because of this sensory overload. We're bombarded by sights and sound and noise. And what Pierce talked about, he cited the research of Marcia McCulloch. And Marcia McCulloch studied indigenous children, children raised in primitive cultures. And we have this stereotype that these primitive cultures aren't as educated and that the children somehow are slower. And what they found was that these children in indigenous cultures in Guatemala, South America, Africa, they had 30% higher awareness of their environment. And when they were put into industrial educational settings, their ability to learn was double that of the industrialized children.
Oh, wow.
These primitive kids had more developed brains because they were raised in a more organic, aware, sensory aware way. And they weren't more primitive. In fact, they were much more advanced. Our children were numbed and dumbed down.
Yeah.
These kids were much sharper.
But it starts already with the medicalization of the birthing process. There it starts already that people in the West are being, Chilton Pierce talks about that there are windows of opportunity for developmental moments. And in the birthing process, many of those moments go past without being used.
Right. The male medical model robbed the birthing experience from feminine wisdom in the Middle Ages. And in fact, not only did the male medical model hijack and rob the birthing process from traditionally the female wisdom experience, but they demonized it. You know, women that were midwives became witches and nags, and they became that knowledge became very undermining and dangerous, and people were burned at the stake at certain periods in our history because they had this feminine wisdom was very threatening to the male archetype and the medical model when that transition happened. And now we're going a little bit more back towards that. But you're right, when the birthing experience became a medical procedure and the child is coming into the world in that kind of a paradigm, good things don't tend to happen.
Yeah, he's scared out of his mind already when he is still in the womb because somebody screws something into his head so the heart tones can be heard. Ah, man, it's amazing.
They did an interesting birthing and addiction study, and it had to do with, this was about 8 or 9 years ago, and there was a cross-cultural study that looked at different parts of the world and where the baby sleeps in relation to the mother. And in most parts of the world, especially the indigenous cultures, the baby sleeps in either the same room as the mother or the same bed, or they co-sleep with the mother, or they sleep on top of the mother. In the United States and in other Western countries, the baby sleeps in the baby room. And the baby room is, for an infant, is a million miles away from mommy. It's down the hall in another part of the house.
Yeah.
And what they found was they started measuring how long it took for that infant to stop crying and to be able to go to sleep, to feel safe, to feel intrinsically safe and nurtured.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And in Japan, traditional Japan, modern Japan is a little bit different, but in traditional Japan, where the baby slept at the foot of the bed, they put the baby down. Within 2 minutes, the baby would fall asleep. The same thing in these other indigenous cultures. The baby would be put down and would fall asleep almost immediately. In the United States, the baby would cry and they would cry, and then we'd have to develop all these bedtime rituals, reading them stories and having a mobile,
yeah,
a rattle. And so the baby started depending on external soothing.
Yes.
Now I need to feel safe and calm, not because I feel safe and calm because I'm close to my mother and I feel intrinsically safe.
Yeah.
And now I need an object to calm me down. And the extrapolation of that is we created a whole generation of nervous, anxious infants that needed things to calm them down. And as they got older, that became toys and eventually maybe things like drugs and alcohol, because now you had a nervous temperament. And that's why we seem to have a much higher rate of anxiety and addictive disorders in Western society than in indigenous cultures. They don't have the same rates of anxiety and addiction that we do. And, it starts back at the womb. It starts by the way we birth and raise our babies, into then how we overstimulate and bombard them with things that make them feel overwhelmed.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that very clearly. And I see that in my surroundings with babies that are born, that mothers are happy to give their child to somebody else so they have their hands free and can do what they like. And I think, what's that?
That child will be on the therapist's couch complaining about having an attachment disorder and not feeling love and having all sorts of other types of issues because of not getting the appropriate nurturing that they needed.
Yeah, exactly. And people underestimate that. And it is amazing that, for me at least, that women have lost their intrinsic motherhood instinct. Yeah,
and now, I have a friend of mine who's a pretty well-known comedian here in the United States. She going back to the screens, and our mothers have abdicated their parenting to the digital babysitter. And she says, it's the digital babysitter with benefits. As long as the mother believes that there's an educational component to it, it makes her feel, okay, at least I'm not being a bad mother. I'm giving my child something educational. And that's the narrative that the mother has to believe in order to keep her child in front of the computer for 8 hours a day. I mean, the average child now, infants are 7 hours in front of a screen, and teenagers are 11 hours in front of a screen. That's the latest average. Children are spending more time in front of screens than they are sleeping, than they are doing anything else in their lives. And most of that time is not educational content. It's mindless, hyper-stimulating video games, social media, YouTube. They did studies out of Case Western University here in the United States on social media and texting. Digital technology tends to have a gender divide. Boys gravitate towards video games and girls gravitate towards social media. I think the temperamental differences between boys and girls. Boys like the adrenaline rush and girls like the social connection piece.
Yeah.
But they defined what was called hyper-networkers. And a hyper-networker was somebody that was on social media for more than 3 hours a day, which, by the way, isn't a lot. By most teenagers I know, 3 hours is nothing compared to.
They never stop doing it.
Right. That's almost like but young people who were on social media for more than 3 hours a day, they had a much higher likelihood to have multiple sexual partners, all these behavioral outcomes, aggressive tendencies, mood disorders, depression. There's the whole phenomenon that we call the Facebook depression phenomenon now, where 3 studies have clearly shown not only does the more time you spend on Facebook lead to higher rates of depression, but the number of friends that you have on Facebook correlates to how depressed you are. The more friends you have on Facebook, the more
Oh,
depressed you are.
yeah.
And they attribute that, one of the things they attribute it to is the social comparison effect. The social comparison effect is this idea that I don't have flesh and blood friends. I have these digital friends. And if I'm having a bad day and I go onto my Facebook feed and I look at everybody's happy vacation photos, look how happy they are, look how happy they are, look how happy they are, it amplifies, well, maybe my life stinks. Maybe my life is not that wonderful.
Oh gosh, that too. Oh yeah, then you can create a depression. But isn't it also that being on the screen does something to their brains, like a dopamine effect, the reward center?
Yeah, so screens, yeah, they're dopaminergic. They're dopamine activating. And they did a study back in 1998 where they found that screens raise dopamine levels as much as sex. They were 100% dopamine activating. A sexual experience raises your dopamine levels 100%. Eating chocolate raises dopamine 50%, by the way. But sex and video games were at the same level. And as adults, maybe we're able to handle that because of the fully developed frontal cortex that you talked about.
Yeah.
But an 8-year-old doesn't have that ability to moderate that. They're having essentially a digital brain orgasm, and then you want to tell that 8-year-old, well, not only do it for 10 minutes, they don't have the impulse control to moderate that.
No.
So the one thing that the recent brain imaging research shows is that dopamine effect, and it's the dopamine reward loop, and then you chase that dopamine effect.
Yeah.
The other part that screens do that is undervalued is they're hyper arousing there's an adrenaline component to it. So it's called, I don't want to get too technical, but it's the HPA is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And that's essentially our fight or flight response. And evolutionarily, as you know, we would go into a fight or flight response when there was some kind of threat.
Yes.
If a tiger was chasing me, I'm going to have an adrenaline surge and in order to be able to run away or to fight that tiger.
Yeah.
What video games do is they put the child into that fight or flight response, but the fight or flight response was only meant to last for 5 or 10 minutes. It was never meant to last for 8 hours or 10 hours. And
No.
so the child is going into that a hyper-aroused fight or flight response hour after hour after hour after hour. And so what happens is it resets their adrenal thermostat at a very high level, and it begins to look like PTSD. These children who are on games all the time, they're very jumpy, and they have a hyper-aroused adrenal system. And you add to that the fact that the games also affect their sleep cycles. It affects their circadian sleep rhythms because the radiant screen, not only is it adrenaline rousing, but it affects it's not that natural light.
No.
It's a very synthetic light that affects our sleep cycle. So now you have an overtired, overstimulated, hyper-aroused child that's in fight or flight response, and that begins to look like ADHD, a mood disorder, we call mood dysregulation. Now what happens? The parent brings that child to the psychiatrist, and now they start giving them medication to treat these symptoms.
Yeah. And Ritalin is cocaine, so methamphetamine. So what are you doing?
Well, it's interesting. I work with a psychiatrist, Victoria Dunkley, in Los Angeles, and she wrote a book, Reset Your Child's Brain. And she won't diagnose or give medication to a child. She's seen over 1,000 children and teenagers in the last 10 years. She won't prescribe or diagnose unless they do a digital detox for 4 to 6 weeks. And then she sees the child again. If after 1 month of no screens, the child still presents symptoms, and what she found is that 65 to 70% of the time, taking away the screen, the symptoms go away. So the child that got brought into her office for ADHD, conduct disorder, even autism, even Asperger's or mild spectrum autism, she found that when the digital devices were taken away, the symptoms went away. That's very powerful. We're treating symptoms that a lot of us think have been caused by a digital toxin. And rather than taking away the source of the problem, we're
Yeah.
symptom treating and creating more problems.
Yeah. Yeah, but that is what Western patent medicine does anyway, treating symptoms,
Exactly.
exchanging them for new ones.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, but when a child has been on screen for such a long time and so many hours a day, is his brain architecture changed? And apparently, from what you were saying, you can reverse that into a more healthy situation.
Yeah, in my book, Glow Kids, I cite some of the studies that show that, yes, the neurophysiology of the brain does change. The one study that I think was the best study that showed that at Indiana University Medical School, they did a study on young people that were not video gamers, because a lot of the studies had shown that video gamers not only does it activate the dopamine response, but that they found that the frontal cortex, the gray matter, was shrinking, which is what happens in substance abuse. Chronic substance abuse shrinks our frontal cortex. So in studies on, let's say, multiple year cocaine addicts or heroin addicts, they have compromised and shrunken frontal cortexes. So there were some studies that showed that chronic video gamers had shrunken frontal cortexes. But the complaint had been, well, maybe people with smaller frontal cortexes are more impulsive, and maybe the game isn't causing that effect. Maybe people who have smaller frontal cortexes are more likely to play video games.
Yeah.
But the study that addressed that was at Indiana University Medical School in 2011, a study by Dr. Wang. He took young people, 19 to 24 years old, that were not video gamers, and then he had them play violent video games for 10 hours a week. So he took an MRI before they started playing, and then he took an MRI after they played for 10 hours a week. And after just 1 week of 10 hours, which, by the way, I have gamers who play 10 hours a day, but 10 hours in 1 week, and he saw measurable changes in the frontal cortex, decreased dense gray matter. These were significant changes, and Dr. Wang said these are the same changes that we see in substance abuse. These control a person's ability to control their impulsivity and their aggression. But what he also did show is what you said, that if then they stopped playing for 2 weeks, and then he took another MRI, and then the brain, because of neuroplasticity, bounced back. It became healthy again. But these were young people that played for 1 week. We don't know the longitudinal damage of young people who are playing for months and years.
Yeah.
We think that their brains can bounce back, but this is an experiment that we don't know the answer to. If you're a gamer playing, some gamers play 40 to 60 hours a week, and you do that for 10 years, we don't know what that damage is going to look like 20 years from now.
No, we have no idea, because it hasn't been happening before. So we are really in a new firmament, in a
New world.
Universe. Yeah. Yeah, brave new world. Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any experience whether food supplements like fatty acids and that sort of things would help people to regain the total complexity of their brain again?
Well, in my addiction clinic, generally speaking, for all addictions, we've seen the benefit of certain supplementation to really help recalibrate a brain and get it back into healthier homeostasis. So everything from amino acid and vitamin B supplementation, magnesium, L-theanine. These are all supplements. 5-HTP. These are all supplements that we've seen have been very helpful in all types of addictive disorders, including digital addiction.
Yeah. I have a presentation about sexuality, and with the many partners that young people have these days, you see an effect in the brain that in the reward center, the dopamine receptor, is meant for one woman and one man to come together and stay together, and that reward center will solidify the bond, so to speak.
Mhm.
But if you have every time another partner, then it's like a Band-Aid that you take off 6 times, and the 7th time for pity, doesn't work anymore. And that affects, you see with young men, they are prone to do suicide because of this phenomenon. They can bounce back again, but then they really have to
Yeah.
not have sex for I don't know how much time. But
And it's not just sex partners. They've also found in correlation with screen addiction and pornography as well. Pornography has become, they find that a lot of, I've worked with video game addicts who become clean and stop gaming, and then they switch to pornography, or they switch to some other, again, hyper-stimulating, hyper-arousing activity, which is just as toxic to the brain as you just said. So interpersonal relationships, sexual relationships can be overwhelming. But these instantly gratifying experiences, whether it's a video game or pornography, internet porn, it also robs people of the interpersonal bonds of real meaningful socialization.
yeah,
So, well, let me go back to the pornography for a second. For the first time, we're seeing adolescent sexual dysfunction. We're seeing erectile dysfunction.
in younger men, yes, yeah.
This has never happened before. 17-year-olds are not supposed to have erectile dysfunction, and we're finding that's a new phenomenon now because they've been so they've been so desensitized that they don't have that normal sexual response anymore. But in terms of the interpersonal aspect of it, we are hardwired social beings. We need face-to-face human contact. And one of the biggest things that these screens are robbing us of is face-to-face contact.
Yeah.
A screen contact and a Facebook friend is not the same as a flesh and blood friend. Dr. Dunbar was an anthropologist years ago who studied primate grooming cultures, and he came up with what was called the Dunbar number, because primates, like human beings, clustered in communities around the same size. So primates, the larger tribe is about 150 primates, and that's how big villages, traditional villages, used to be, about 150 people. But the key essential Dunbar, it came to be known as the Dunbar number, was 5. 5 close interpersonal friendships. That is the number that we need to be socially, emotionally, and psychologically healthy. And what we're finding now is in this epidemic of depression and isolation, and as a byproduct of modern society, people no longer have those close ties to face-to-face friends. Those are disappearing. And so if I need 5 face-to-face friends to be emotionally happy, but I've got 500 Facebook friends, those friends are a parody of real socialization. They'd found that for a conversation to have emotional resonance and psychological resonance, people had to maintain eye contact 70% of the time during that conversation. And teenagers today were only maintaining eye contact 20% of the time because they tend to look down and they're used to looking at their devices. They've lost the art of eye contact, and eye contact is a very fundamental social skill that is life-sustaining. And we're losing all of these things.
Babies do that. They can look at you, pew, like that. And then it seems like they're downloading God knows what from your brain. It's amazing. But I see that many adults also, I make very consciously eye contact with people all the time.
Right.
But I see people go every which way but straight on.
And it's changing year by year, again, because I've worked with 1,000 young people over the last 10 years. You see it get worse each year. Each year, the eye contact of young people gets more and more compromised. And I have to think it's a direct byproduct of these wonderful educational devices that we've been sold. And I think it's time that, we say the emperor has no clothes. I've gotten as a result of my book, Glow Kids, I've gotten emails from hundreds of parents and parenting groups who are fighting back, who are they're beginning to fight back to their schools, to their communities, and they're saying, we don't want devices when our children are that young. And I've had parents who've had to fight their schools and had to say, if you give this device to my child, I'm pulling my child out of the school and transferring them to another school. And some schools have been responsive and supportive. And some schools, I had one parent that the school threatened to call Child Protective Services.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because she didn't want her 5-year-old to have an iPad. They were going to call Child Protective Services. And I had to call up, I had to advocate for this poor woman. And I had to call the lieutenant. Luckily, they know, they respect me. And I said, you're going to call Child Protective Services because this poor woman doesn't want her 5-year-old to have an iPad? Are you kidding me? And they back off when you put some pressure on them, especially when there's some media involvement. But it's amazing. It's amazing what's happening.
Yeah, but I think that new societal habit pattern with screens is like a religion.
Mm.
You get emotional responses, not rational ones.
Yeah. Yeah, it is like a religion. It is like a new dogma.
Like vaccination. I see so many parallels there.
Yeah, I also see parallels vaccination, and with actually I see parallels to the cigarette industry in the 1950s, where the cigarette companies they had research at the time that showed that cigarettes were carcinogen, and yet they kept marketing them to children. They created Joe Camel and cartoon characters to smoke to get kids hooked on cigarettes when they knew that these things were dangerous for kids. And it took a class action lawsuits to be able to then have them take some responsibility. That's currently what I'm fighting now. There's a woman in Maryland who's creating legislation right now about limiting screen time. And I've been contacted by a couple of class action lawsuit attorneys who want to sue the technology companies. What our goal would be just to put warning labels, just put a warning label on the digital devices and say, the words would say, excessive screen usage can lead to clinical disorders in children. In the United States, the professional football, they have a social consciousness. They put commercials, public service announcements that if you develop a gambling problem as a result of watching professional sports, here's a phone number that you can call for help. The alcohol industry, they have the same thing. If you develop drink responsibly, and if you develop a drinking problem, here's a number that you can call for help. Well, the technology companies are not doing their responsibility. They're not at least even acknowledging Mark Zuckerberg or Apple. They're not saying, if you develop a problem with technology, here's a number you can call for help, because that would mean to admit that they know that there's potentially a problem. But they're hiring the top behavioral psychologists to make these games and these devices as addicting as possible. They're not addicting by chance. They're addicting by design, and they know that.
Yeah, I'm convinced of that. Yes, yeah. You can social engineer a whole society with things like this, and that is what they do. In the beginning, we spoke about chaos. Well, here you have chaos. It's also the isolation of the individual.
The isolation of the individual, right? Fracture the social bonds and fracture the communal aspects, and now you have the isolated fragment of individual.
Yeah,
and I get periodically emailed. There's the American Psychological Association, and they have classified job ads, and occasionally I get an email from them, and it'll be from a gaming company looking for psychologists, the top behavioral psychologists to work for the gaming company, and it'll say looking for top behavioral psychologists to work for Mahjong or one of the gaming companies to make the games addicting, and I'll get these emails, and I guess they don't, they send them to whoever they have on their mailing list of psychologists, and again, they test these devices they beta test them on teenagers, and what they do is they hire these beta testers. They give them $100 Amazon cards to volunteer, and then they hook them up to galvanic skin responses and the blood pressure gauges. And they have the teenager play the game, and if the blood pressure doesn't go to 180 over 140 within 3 minutes, they go back and they make the game more arousing, more adrenaline surging. And so they get these poor children in this adrenal response, this blood pressure spiking response, and that's the goal. And what, unfortunately, what's happening in the United States, they're trying to what's called gamify the classroom. Now they're trying to eliminate teachers, and they're trying to make educational software that looks like a video game. And so you're supposed to learn because you're getting engaged by getting points in the game. But they've done studies, and when kids play an edu game, they're called edu games, they're not learning anything. They're just focusing on point acquisition.
Yeah.
And so it's a big scam. It's a big falsehood that people like Rupert Murdoch invested $1 billion in an education technology company called Amplify. Rupert Murdoch doesn't care about education in children. Rupert Murdoch saw a media opportunity to capitalize on children.
Yeah.
That's what I find offense to. If you want to be a capitalist and make money on adults, so be it. Adults are adults. But to capitalize on helpless children, to lie to their parents about some of these devices, and to treat us like guinea pigs, that's what I find really offensive, and what I'm trying to fight back against and raise awareness about.
Yes. Well, that's the point. I think the awareness with the parents is not yet there. We have a lot of work to do there. And by the way, you speak about these psychologists that need to up the dosage in the game, but isn't it so that that dosage has to be raised every year in general, because you have that effect.
Right. With any drug, you develop a tolerance level, and then you increase the dosage to get the same effect. Joseph Chilton Pierce talked about in television back in the days of television, that ancient thing called television. They used to have a startle effect, and the startle effect used to be right before the commercial, and people would be able to pay attention back in the 70s for about 15 minutes. That was the maximum that a person could pay attention to a television show. And then they would have a startle effect to kind of wake you up again, and then commercial break, and then another few minutes, another startle effect. And what they found is as time went on, the startle effects had to be less and less and less time. That then they had to give a startle effect every 8 minutes, and then every 5 minutes, and then every 3 minutes. And now if you watch even children's television or MTV,
it's one big startle effect.
It's a constant startle effect. It's a bang, 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 bang.
Yeah.
And then when you take away the startle effect and you see these children that are perpetually getting stimulated, they can't sit still. And then it looks like ADHD. And then they go down the path of medication. And that's those neurological problems that we talked about before.
Yeah. That's a road to hell. That is not okay. Yeah, I wonder also, I see a link with children, teenagers who want to go bungee jumping because they don't feel anything anymore. So they have to go way out to eventually have that sensation still somewhere, somehow.
Well, you're absolutely, look at these extreme sports. The extreme sports have now blown up where, 20 years ago you had some skateboarding and you had some snowboarding, but now everything's extreme. Everything has to be an extreme sport, higher, more intense, more dangerous to get the same effect, because these kids you're right, they don't want to take a bicycle ride through the park. That's not adrenaline surging enough. You're right. So it's more risks, more adrenaline, more surge, and what is that? At a certain point, where does that end? Where does that end?
Yeah, I have no idea. It can't be good. That's what I have for a conclusion. Yeah. The violence that is in computer games. If you see the principle garbage in, garbage out, you would say if kids, teenagers see a lot of violence in video games and they can shoot people, they can kill people, but these puppets stand up afterwards when they have been killed. And so their sense of reality is out of the window, but also they are desensitized towards killing someone.
Well, there was a psychology professor at West Point who wrote, West Point is the military academy here in the United States, and he wrote a book in 2000 and it might have been 2005, Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill. And he called these violent first-person shooter games murder simulators. That, from the military standpoint, that was wonderful. I mean, right now here in the United States, if you go to a lot of military recruitment centers, they look very much like video arcades. The kids play these war games in the recruitment center, and then at the end of that arcade, there's the recruitment officer ready to sign up that young man to go into the military, because and I've worked with young people who were playing Call of Duty, combat game, all weekend. Then the one young man came into my office on Monday and he said, I did it. I signed up for the Marines. I said, you've been playing for 72 hours and viewing the military as an extension of just the gaming experience. And I said, once you're in the Marines, there's no off button. You can't shut that off. You're in.
Exactly.
But Iowa State, at Iowa State University, that's where they've done 30 years of aggression research, media effects on aggression. And that was Dr. Craig Anderson and his associates. And they showed conclusively that the aggression and violence effect was causal, not correlational, causal, that the violent media was causing more aggressive behavior. And the American Academy of Pediatrics had concurred. In the American Medical Association, there was a media violence letter that was drafted in 2000, and the first one was 2000, and they redid a later one, where all the heads of the various medical communities, American Psychiatric Association, they all signed on to this letter saying these effects are creating an aggressive, violent tendencies in children, and it's no longer in dispute that these are the byproducts of that. So there have been quite a few cases in the United States here of kids who have seemed to have paralleled things that they've done in the game in real life and have hurt people. The most famous case was highlighted on 60 Minutes. Devin Smith in Alabama was a young man who had been playing a game called Grand Theft Auto, which you simulate a lot of violence and stealing cars. And it's a very horrible game where you're actually taking baseball bats and you're hitting prostitutes and you're beating people. It's a very graphically violent game. And this young man had been playing this game for hours and hours a day. And he had been found in a stolen car. He was sleeping in a stolen car, and the police arrested him. And when they took him to the police precinct, the policeman said to him, you're probably going to spend some time, you might do some years in jail because now you were found in the stolen car. And the boy snapped. And what they found out afterwards, in Grand Theft Auto, there's a scene where a person gets arrested in the police station, and what the boy did replicated what the character does in Grand Theft Auto. And what the character does is he takes the gun away from the policeman, he kills the policeman, he walks down the hall, kills the second policeman, he walks into the dispatcher's office, kills the third policeman, and then he steals a police car and he drives away. That's what that 16-year-old boy did. He killed 3 police officers, drove away in the police car, and when they arrested him 100 miles away, 50 kilometers away, he said his first words were, life is just a video game. And in court, they tried to use a video game defense, saying that the 16-year-old boy effectively was delusional and was reliving the video game. The judge did not allow that defense. The boy was found guilty. He is now on death row. He's waiting to be executed. The families of the police sued the game companies, the game manufacturers, saying that they were the ones that shaped and influenced this boy. And unfortunately, they lost their lawsuits as well. But it was clear that this boy's actions were shaped by his video gaming.
Yeah, and I think the judge knew that he had to created precedent. How you say that? The precedent.
Precedent. Yeah, the judge was afraid that he would set a precedent.
So
Yeah.
that other gamers cannot get mercy either. So people really have to have a warning against that sort of behavior.
And if there was a warning, that's my contention. At least if there was a warning label, at least a parent can then maybe pause and say, oh, wait, maybe I should be a little bit more cautious when I'm allowing my children to do these wonderfully educational things.
Yeah, these wonderful educational games. Oh, I was watching with my grandson. He was 3 at the time, and there was this huge plasma thing in front of him. And I saw in 1 minute, I saw 3 things on the screen that I thought, this is the wrong information for this little kid.
Wow.
There was a biker, and he was driving through nature, and he had a beer, and he drank the beer, and he tossed the can. And there was a polar bear on the ice, and the ice was melting, so the global warming bullshit came. I mean, in 1 minute. Amazing. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
So it is social engineering. People get mind controlled. They are presented with what they are supposed to think and how they are supposed to react, and everything human, really human, dies off, withers away. I don't know, but that's what I see.
And a lot of these games are war games.
Yeah.
They're shaping children to be little soldiers early on. I mean, we criticize ISIS for training their children to be violent and to be mercenaries. But what are we doing to our kids when we let them play war games and we're training them to be effectively little soldiers from a young age? The only research and some of the brain imaging research, the only neurological benefit to video gaming was they found that there can be an increase in pattern recognition and reflex time. And so those were the 2 little benefits. And then everything else was all these other clinical disorders, like I said, the aggression, the depression, the addictive effects. And then they asked, so what is that beneficial for? Pattern recognition and reflex time. And they actually said, well, that would make for a wonderful drone pilot to be able to fly drone planes. And again, going back to the social engineering comment that you made, is that effectively what we're trying to do? Are we trying to just create little drone pilots that could fly drones in this future world of automation and soldiers and aggressive behavior? Is that what we're doing under the pretense of educational and
cowardly behavior? I mean, when you are a drone pilot and you kill people, you are behind a console in I don't know where in the United States, and you kill people and in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever.
It looks like a video game. It looks like a video game.
Looks like a video game. And I heard one military person say these guys are very good at that, these gamers.
Right. They're hand-eye coordination.
There's one problem with them. They don't have an off switch.
That's what he said?
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so they don't have the empathy, I think, because, again, a lot of the games that I've worked with, because empathy is also another developmental window that requires eye contact and nurturing and interpersonal socialization. If you're a kid plopped in front of a screen, you're not going to develop that human empathy. So when you eventually do become that drone pilot, and you're destroying what seems like not even real human beings because it seems like a video game. I will tell you that the very famous case here in the United States, we had the biggest school shooting that happened a few years ago in Newtown, Connecticut. A young man called Adam Lanza, who was a 16-year-old.
Oh, yeah.
Who killed 25 people.
Sandy Hook.
And you had your adult shooter in Norway who killed 80.
Yeah, but
he was a gamer too, by the way. But the boy here in Connecticut who killed all those kids. I've read the FBI report. I read the Attorney General's report. I am absolutely convinced he was in a state of video game psychosis. He had psychiatric problems. He was autistic. He had severe OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. His mother pulled him out of school, and all he did was play video games in the basement. And the games, the FBI did a gaming profile after the murders, and he was playing a game called Modern Warfare 2, where you're a shooter who goes into an airport and you start shooting women and children in an airport. Very realistic game. And they're crawling away in their own blood, and then you're shooting them in the head. And he had 22,000 headshots before he committed his murders at the school. He was also playing a game, and you won't believe this, Desiree. He was playing a game called School Shooter. And in this video game, you play a school shooter, and you go from classroom to classroom shooting children. He was playing this game the months before the shooting. I'm entirely convinced that this psychiatrically imbalanced young man, was fully in the throes of a video game psychotic episode, and I'm convinced that those children weren't human beings. They were just an extension of the game for him. And the FBI said, this is a gamer who was trying to get high score. That's why I picked an elementary school, because there was easy targets. And the reason the FBI also thought that he was reliving a video game was, in video game culture, if you get shot by another player, you lose your point total. But if you shoot yourself, you keep your points. And at the end, when he was circled by the police, he shot himself. And they speculated, the FBI did, that it was to keep his point total. Because when they went back to his room after all the murders, they found that he had a spreadsheet, and he had every serial killer with a point total, like a video game point total. He was trying to be high score.
Oh God.
So that's an extreme bad outlier example. I'm not saying that every child who plays a video game is going to go kill 25 students, but the psychiatrically vulnerable ones are much more likely to do something like that. And I think if he had never been exposed to video games, we never would have had that horrible outcome.
No, but plus, if he was on psychiatric medication, then his judgment was out of the window anyway.
Right.
Yeah. There is another point that is very important. You talked about Adam Lanza being in the basement with only that artificial light. Sunlight is an essential macronutrient for every living being on the planet Earth.
Right.
And that's one thing. And another thing is, if we don't have enough, and that means you need to go out, not behind the car windshield, not behind a window, but no sunglasses.
Right.
You really have to have that light go into your system, because 85% of the sunlight goes to your endocrinal system.
Right.
15 is for visits to see.
Well, one of my favorite colleagues is Dr. Stephen Ilardi, and he wrote a book called The Depression Cure. And he also looked at indigenous cultures. He also looked at, and there are some indigenous cultures that have zero rates of depression. In Papua New Guinea, they have no depression rates. An anthropologist lived with them for 10 years, and out of 2,000 Papuans, not one of them was depressed. And what Dr. Ilardi did is he tried to find out, he thought that something like depression, which, let's face it, depression correlates to addiction and some of these other issues. They're all comorbid. Were byproducts of our modern lifestyle.
Absolutely.
And he highlighted sunlight as well. So what he did is he said, what are some of the common themes in these more indigenous lifestyles that we're not doing in our modern lifestyle? So what he did is he found 4 things. It was sunlight, it was exercise, it was omega-3. These cultures had very high omega-3 diets, and it was social bonds. They were much more communal societies. So he took 900 severely clinically depressed people that tried SSRI antidepressants, which they had been ineffective for. And For 8 weeks, he made them do what was called the therapeutic lifestyle changes, TLC. And they had to do an hour of exercise, an hour of sunlight, some kind of group activity, and they were supplemented with high levels of omega-3. And after 8 weeks, almost 85, 87% of these people had significantly improved moods. Their depression was treated in a better way than they could with medication. They did. So he's a big believer in sunlight and exercise and all these things that our modern society has taken away. And all these children who are on screens, they're obese, they're not getting sunlight, they're not getting exercise, and they're not socializing. So those are all the ingredients for psychological dysfunction.
Yeah, and there's another point. I have a doctor friend, and she has been investigating and researching this subject to now to the tiniest dot and iota. The light of the sun needs to fall exactly on your fovea, on your yellow spot in the eye. And what vaccination does, vaccination can disable cranial nerves, and that is the work of Andrew Molden. He said if you see the whites of the eyes not being symmetrical, up, down, or here and in the middle, then he could say exactly which cranial nerve was not getting blood enough because of big proteins that were either in the vaccines or immune complexes that had been creating ischemia. And that way, then the light cannot fall straight on the fovea. And that has a cascade of results afterwards.
Wow. Well, what are the vaccination laws in your country?
We are not obliged to vaccinate, but it's an emotional blackmail that is very strong, and all the doctors believe vaccinations are fantastic. So at preschoolers, parents want to know whether every baby there is vaccinated, while it's the vaccinated who can shed the vaccine pathogens, or they are so immune suppressed, that they have every infection that there is going on in the day school or wherever they are. So it's the non-vaccinated children who are the healthiest. And
of course. Well, here in the United States, you can't attend school unless you get vaccinated, and only recently they started doing religious exemptions, which is what my wife and I used. We had to go get my friend who's a priest and write us a letter saying that I happen to be Greek Orthodox. Between you and I, I'm not that religious, but we used we had to jump through all these hoops to tell my children's school we don't want the vaccinations, and it's for religious reasons. But it's absurd because I have a friend who's an emergency room doctor, and she's one of the organizers of a local anti-vaccine group. She swears by it with her child. Her child got the vaccine, had been verbal, beautiful, healthy, normal child, got the fever. 2 days later became nonverbal and went down the road of autism. And she was entirely convinced. And yet here you're viewed as being some kind of conspiracy theorist, lunatic, because we know as people of science that you can't prove a negative. So to say that vaccines don't cause problems, they say there's no proof that vaccine causes problems, but evidence of absence isn't
exactly.
You go down that, if there's a concern, why are you forcing parents with certainly shocking children's systems with these vaccines, and forcing them to do that is just so
well, it's if you only use pure logic. I made a breakdown of all the vaccines that are being used in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. And I broke down the culture mediums that are being used in the vaccine, which strains of the pathogens, what adjuvantia, what products during the process of creating the vaccines. And when you see the list of toxic metal compounds and other chemicals, when you see the DNA and RNA of other species that go into the vaccines from the culture mediums, I mean, dogs, cows, chickens, monkeys, you name it.
That's still, they're not still using thimerosal. I mean, has at least that gotten out of the vaccine?
Yeah, well, it's not the thimerosal dummy. That's what I always say, because anything in a vaccine can create damage, and you never know. It's like a Russian roulette. You never know which baby has a tendency of not being able, I mean, detoxing the stuff. They can't do that anyway yet.
Right.
So and what happens with babies is that they usually get diarrhea. Oh, then he can have too little water in his system. So diarrhea has to stop. And then he gets eczema, because the skin is the second way of getting rid of toxins. Oh, no, that's not good either. So we put a salve on top of that. And then there is only the lungs. So the child produces asthma.
Which is why we have the asthma epidemic that we're having. Children never used to have asthma. 40 years ago, there was no asthma. Now it's everybody's got an inhaler.
And when the kids are going to school, then you have these kids with these green letters underneath their noses. And the snot letters. And they have ears that are stuck with God knows what, for sort of muck and stuff. So they need these little things in their ears.
The tubes.
Yeah, the tubes. Well, that's all vaccination damage. So there was then this doctor in Holland who thought it was a good idea to make a vaccine against ear infection. And then I had to laugh. I said, yeah, you vaccinate a kid, he gets ear infections, and then you give him a vaccine for the infection.
Right.
Come on. So that is the way they think. And you cannot explain to them with simple logic. I mean, how can you expect that health is being created when you inject a baby?
Yeah. Metals?
Yeah. Parts of animals with the contaminations that animal had, the microbial contaminations that nobody knows what it is.
Right.
And very, very well known is the SV40 in the polio vaccines from the green African monkeys.
Wow.
And they find exactly those strains of SV40 in the brain tumors of adult Americans. So vaccine adverse effects is either from the first second to 6 years later.
Wow. Wow.
And I'm postulating here that someone who has been vaccinated, that might make him or her more prone to screen addiction.
Yeah. Well, to me, that would be a pretty logical inference, because if it's compromising their overall medical well-being and physiological well-being, any kind of vulnerability like that is going to make someone more vulnerable to screen effects. So it's a comorbidity. I would imagine that's the comorbidity with this other amplifier.
And it's always a combination of factors. It's never one thing, but that is from your research also, it's very clear. It's always the individual makeup of the person plus what is in his environment, the epigenetic.
Do you think it's just scientific dogmatism, what we call scientism, that leads people to this kind of, or do you think it's more nefarious?
Well, I link it to the fact that the Western medical curriculum is created basically in 1910 with Abraham Flexner. And it was Rockefeller who has implemented the pharmaceutically based Western patent medicine the world over. I have a book by Morris Beale, and he mentions a lot of American universities who have taken the bait, namely money from the Rockefeller Foundation, with the stipulation that they would stop immediately anything that had nothing to do with pharmaceutical approaches. So if you took money from Rockefeller, then it was the pharmaceutical road, period.
Right.
And I have, in that book, there are 2 Dutch universities are mentioned, Leiden and Utrecht. And with the amounts, $28,000 and $36,000. And I suppose it was around 1946 or so that happened.
Wow.
And with that money, these universities have shaped their medical curriculum to the pharmaceutical approach. And that has happened the world over. And what I see when I try to talk to these mainstream doctors, as soon as I compare it to a tunnel vision. They have been educated within a tunnel vision.
Right.
And as soon as I have half step next to the tunnel, they can't hear me.
Right.
And they won't hear me. They don't want to. And there is a beautiful series now, Betrayal, and that is doctors who were educated in this tunnel vision, but because of something happened in their own lives, just like with you and me, they woke up, they tried to find other venues, they did, and these are doctors who work with functional medicine, meaning hear the story of the person and see what processes in the body are not working anymore. Give the body the substances that it needs to be able to do those processes again. And then the healing mechanism of the body, that is our innate healing system, that can kick in then. And it's amazing. There's one doctor who had MS, and she had been studying in her tunnel vision books for 7 years, and her MS got worse and worse and worse until she could not do anything else but lie down in a wheelchair. And while she tells a story on the Betrayal series, she is there just like you and me. So she totally reversed it.
What did she use? What mechanism? What was her treatment protocol? What was her outside the box treatment that got her better?
Giving the body the substances, the nutrients it needs to do and of course detoxing is very important. We are full with aluminum from the chemtrails. That's not nice for your brain either, of course. Yeah. So you have to detox. You have to look at your diet, especially in America. Food is dangerous. I mean, on your labels, you can't see whether it's genetically manipulated.
Right.
And it creates havoc in the body.
Right. We have horrible Monsanto, agribusiness here is runs things.
And fluoride in the water that takes your IQ 15 points down.
What's interesting, you said that how it took people sometimes going through their own personal trials and tribulations to wake up.
Yeah. That's the only way that doctors wake up from that rut.
But it's funny that you talk about I've been aware about the fluoride for a while too, and it's like I've had to be careful because I've gotten a lot of mainstream media attention, which has been wonderful, and I almost have to cautiously tailor my message in a way because I know, like you said, if I step 2 inches to the left, or I'm talking more candidly with you about some of what I think are the conspiratorial aspects of it, but that will invalidate the message. And it's interesting because even with digital effects, there's a subset, I focus on the clinical addictive effects, and because I have university bona fides, I can get my foot in the door with certain media. But there's the electromagnetic subset. There's a few really wonderfully well-educated, well-versed people that have become friends and colleagues. Camila Reese is one of them, who are trying to, raise awareness and ring the bell about the electromagnetic effects of what we're doing. We're radiating ourselves into cancer, and
Yeah.
the World Health Organization with cell phones and the glioma, doubling rates of glioma in the brain. And those, to me, which are very well documented and potentially worse than any of the clinical effects I'm talking about, because at the end of the day, if you're dead, it doesn't matter what clinical effects you have, because those are much more potentially fatal, and they're considered on the fringe. Their messages can't, and it's funny, I've tried to sort of connect them to some media, and they're articulate and well-spoken and well-researched, and can't penetrate with their message because it's considered too out there.
They're not politically correct. Yes.
In fact, just last week here in the United States, in the San Francisco Chronicle, which is the main newspaper in San Francisco, just came out. It was a front page story that the California Association of Health, they had known for the last 6 years about cell phone effects and cancer effects on the brain, and they weren't releasing any of these guidelines or information to the public, and it took a lawsuit for the Attorney General to finally release this information that they had. They had these studies, and they said, we didn't want to create a public panic, and it took a lawsuit for them to release information that they'd been sitting on while these increased rates of cancer had grown. And it hits close to me because my sister-in-law is currently dying of brain cancer. She's 48 years old, and she has a very extremely rare aggressive form of brain cancer that they've done 3 surgeries, they've done chemo, they've done everything now, and she's at the last stages of her life. And it was on the side of her head where she's talking on her cell phone.
Yeah.
And but God forbid you even to the oncologist, if you even hint at, is this possibly related? Oh, no, there's no evidence of that. Well, no, actually, yes, there is. The World Health Organization said that in 2011. Yes, there is some evidence of that. And why isn't, as a mainstream oncologist, can't you even acknowledge that that's the possibility of what may have caused this? No history of cancer in the family, no other, it was just, so, yeah.
But mainstream doctors are never interested in the cause. They are only interested in treating.
Right. Right.
That's the key word. Cure is a no word, and treating is what it's all about.
And like we say, surgeons cut, and if you go to a surgeon, you're going to get cut, and if you go to a car mechanic, you're going to get a wrench. Whatever specialist you get to, they see things too.
Yeah. It's amazing. Nutrient deficiencies are also very influential on the brain.
Yeah.
Plus that, as I said, we are all full of it, aluminum.
Yeah.
And that is also in the chemtrails. So nobody escapes from getting aluminum into the body. And then you have the women with the deodorants with aluminum, and
the mercury in the seafood, and the
the cans with aluminum lining or aluminum cans. And if you have a acidic beverage, then you drink aluminum. Period. Yeah. They did that with a school class. They were invited to drink Capri-Sonne. That is a floppy aluminum bag with orange juice in it. It took a month for the whole class to get ADHD.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So detoxing is very important. And vaccines are laced with aluminum. Gardasil and Cervarix, the HPV vaccines, I wrote a book about those. Obscene, really.
So how do you navigate a healthy life then, in terms of, like you said, there are environmental toxins and food? How do you short of living off the grid in the bubble, how do you?
Yeah, how do you do that? Well, detoxing, loads of vitamin C, and I have a far infrared sauna. That's not the red light that is warm, but you can't see it, but it feels hot. And a good far infrared sauna goes 4 to 14 micron frequency.
Right.
And that means that the water in your body gets vibrated, and so everything that's in the cell that's not supposed to be there vibrates out of it, and you lose it, 80% of it, through your perspiration fluids. And it's very good for people with Lyme who have already challenges on their kidneys and their liver for detoxing.
Right. Right.
And being a tropical person, I had my youth in Indonesia. I love that little box with the heat, and it's very hot, but it's different from a regular sauna. It's a different way of heat.
And what is it called again?
A far infrared sauna, FIR sauna, FIR sauna.
Okay. So I have a cousin in Greece. I go to Greece every year, and
Oh, lovely.
and my mother was from. My mother just passed away about a month ago, and she was but she was from Cephalonia on the Italian side of Greece. And I have a cousin there, Maki. He's the crazy cousin that people would make fun of, but because he's essentially off the grid, he and his family, and my kids. I have 9-year-old twins, and I got the most amazing experience there with him because my wife is very organic, sustainable, and gardening. She wants her own honeybees, but we went to my cousin Maki's compound, and he is entirely self-sufficient. He makes his own honey, his own olive oil, his own wine, his own cheese. He made his own kiln to bake his own bread out of the clay out of his property. And so my kids bake bread at 6 o'clock in the morning with him, and everything is off of his property. And he's a little off center. And like you said, he goes, I don't rely on anything from anyone in terms of especially the Greek government, which is
it's a mess,
in rough shape. But he lives as an organic lifestyle, and he's not exactly what you would call but he created his own windmill, his own solar panels. He's a tinkerer, an inventor, not educated, but just a resourceful guy.
Logic thinking brings you far. Yeah.
And when we stayed with him for a couple of days, and even just eating his food for those 2 days, and he used to say to me, "Eat, Nico, eat. You'll never eat food like this in the United States. You're never going to eat food that's this pure." And he was right. You felt the sense of this was real food that was not processed through any, and that's the way he lived. And it's not an easy life, obviously. He's got to get up early and sort of take care of it.
It's hard work, but you get the pure thing then. Yes, absolutely.
And he's healthy.
Yeah, must be. He's out in the sun working his body, doing things. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
We were designed that way. We were not designed to sit down all day.
Well, that's what that Dr. Ilardi that I talked about, the depression cure, that's exactly what he says. He talks about sitting is the smoking of the 21st century, and we weren't designed to be so sedentary and immobile and so isolated and fragmented. And
inside,
Well, and they said it takes our evolution 50 generations for genetic change to happen. So we're still in hunter and gatherer bodies living digital and sedentary lives.
We're doing stupid things, really. And in this society, I heard someone say, Johan Hari, I think it was, he has a TED presentation.
Yeah, he wrote the Chasing the Scream, the addiction. Johan Hari. Yeah, he wrote Chasing the Scream, and he's an addiction. What that addiction?
Yeah, and he said the opposite of addiction is connection.
Right. I quote that. I love that. He's so right. As an addiction psychologist, I couldn't agree with that more. It's a disease of isolation, a disease of disconnection, and yet we think it's so funny. It's so how Orwellian when you name something social media. well, it should be social, we're social animals, so social media should be somehow wonderful, and yet it's having the
No,
opposite effect.
it's totally not social. They call it social, but it is the opposite.
Right, right.
Yeah, like uh, not adverse effects, but in Dutch we have words that describe adverse effects, but in the sense that it's effects that are next to the one you want.
Right, right.
And if you call it side effects, and
Yeah.
if you call it side effect, emotionally you do something with a person because a side effect is not so bad, but a side effect of vaccines can be death. I mean, that's not a side effect.
Well, that's like every pharmaceutical commercial here in the United States. They have a commercial, again, and they're all, happy bike riding, snowboarding people.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
the narrator of the commercial always has to say the side effects. And very quickly at the end of the commercial, side effects can lead to death. Your brain can explode. Blah 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 blah.
Yeah. It goes. Yeah, you can't hear what they say. Yeah.
You can't hear it, but then you're always, death is always in there. Side effects include death.
They speak in fine print.
Right. Your heart can explode. Your brain can implode, and yeah, the pharmaceutical industrial complex. And again, always my $64,000 question is, by design or by chance, but I guess at the end of the day, does it really even matter? It's happening. These adverse effects are happening. Whether there's 10 Illuminati that are plotting this by design, or whether it's just happening as a byproduct of industrialization, the outcomes are ultimately the same. So
exactly.
I don't know if it matters that much.
Yeah. Well, I'm nasty. As a journalist, I can say what I want, of course. I don't have a title. I'm not a professor. I can do what I want. So I call Western patent medicine, I call it a slow kill business model.
The slow kill business model. That says it nicely. That about sums it up, right?
Yeah, the shortest way to say it. Yeah. But yeah, well, we had so many things. Oh yeah, the socializing part. We were on that. I think that people who have a tendency to addiction, is there something like a trauma in their youth or even in the wombs already that might be there and act as a trigger?
Yeah, I think we talk about, so we know that people who have suffered abuse are 7 times more likely to have an addiction disorder, whether it's childhood trauma or sexual abuse or abandonment or attachment issues. We know that people who have addiction, 65 to 70% of the time, there's underlying anxiety and or depression. So, addiction, I work a lot with Dr. Schaefer at Harvard University's Division of Addiction, and he has a thing called the syndrome model of addiction. And addiction is not even really its own standalone disorder. No. Addiction is just a self-medicating part of other discomforts, and whether those are psychiatric discomforts or emotional discomfort. So I'm much more likely to self-medicate or escape my intrapsychic discomfort of anxiety, depression, trauma. And so, yes, addiction is that. And so if I've had sexual abuse, I would say anecdotally, probably 50% of the clients that I work with who have addiction have had some kind of sexual or pretty profound trauma in their lives. The others have almost invariably anxiety and depression. Seems to be a main staple in addiction as well. I've met very few, I'm trying to think if I've met any in the 1,000 or so people that I've treated who were just addicts and didn't have any of these other global types of issues as well.
Yeah. It's in regular illnesses also, it's never one standalone cause. It's always a combination of things.
There's also a concept, I work a lot, which happens to be one of my specialties, with people who are in what we might call existential crisis.
Mm-hmm.
of meaning and purpose in their lives.
Yeah.
Civilization lends itself to that. I wrote a book that my first book looked at Greek philosophy as a transformative method, because you ask yourself, who am I? What am I? What's the purpose of my life? And if you can meaningfully answer those questions or begin to walk the path of those answers, your life begins to have meaning and purpose, and then you're less likely to lose yourself in the addictive escape. But oftentimes, if you're a parent who's lost a child, or a person who's lost their career or retired, many of my clients enter into the world of addiction in that transitional void. I've lost something. I'm having an identity crisis or a crisis of meaning and purpose. And in that void, I might as well just drown myself or lose myself in addictive excess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Meaning in your life is so important. Yeah. I remember that I had no meaning in my life when I was 20 or so, and I was very depressed. I remember how that was.
Yeah.
And I remember that I pulled myself up, troop like that, and I started to do 3 things at the same time: silversmithing, jazz ballet, and acting. And that kept me so busy that,
But you were able to pull yourself up, and sometimes that's the challenge. So you pulled yourself out of it. For some people, they can't. They're so dampened that they can't get out of bed, or they get
and also I have my youngest son is addicted, and I have detoxed him twice from the GHB that he is on.
Yeah.
And that is quite a challenge, that detoxing process. But it's not about the detoxing.
Right.
And that is what all the institutions, they don't get it. Because, you're detoxed, okay, speak with a psychiatrist. Yeah, and what does the psychiatrist do? He comes with his stupid psychopharmaca. And then I asked the psychiatrist, have you ever heard about nutritional medicine, orthomolecular medicine? No, I don't know anything about it. I said, well, that might be a nice study for when you have time on your hands. Because
I think that has to be part of the solution, right? Because detox is just addresses you vacuum out the substances, but you still have the underlying cause. Yeah. If there's a nutrient imbalance, if there's a psychological distress, if there's those other issues have to be addressed, or else what we see is people who just get detox keep coming back and back and back unless
12 times. There was a video documentary in the Netherlands. 12 times these people go back to these institutions. And I think, this is what Einstein said, doing the same thing over and over again and expect another result. That's insanity.
I've worked with clients who have been to rehabs and detoxes over 50 times.
Oh, God.
And well, sometimes it's an unwillingness to do the piece, so to get honest and sort of do the work. We talk about the work of recovery. What is everybody's perfect storm of addiction is different. Like you said, some people have childhood trauma. Some people have genetic predispositions, neurochemical imbalances, micronutrient imbalances. It's all part of the puzzle. And if it's something like, we had one woman who kept coming back, pretty successful woman who had overcompensated and was drinking herself to death, but had been very successful in her career. The rehab that I run is a very, I hate to say it, it's a very high-end rehab, so it tends to be successful people that are there, but meanwhile they're self-destructing. And it wasn't until the 4th time that she came with us that she remembered the trauma, sexual trauma that she had experienced when she was younger. And then we had to do that work to help her work through the trauma. And then once the trauma was released, then she was able to move forward in her life. But until she got to that heart of the problem, she was stuck.
I know exactly what you mean. And with my son, it is that he cannot go to that place where the answer is what happened.
Yeah. Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah.
Not yet. But 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 just because he hasn't been able to yet doesn't mean I'm a big believer of you never give up, because as long as a person's alive and going, they still have the opportunity. I never give up on anybody who's struggling, because sometimes nurses will be a little cynical. Oh, they're back again. And because it took me several times. I know from my own personal experience, I was in drug and alcohol treatment several times before, the cure stuck. And either sometimes you're not ready yet to go there, like you said about your son. And
Yeah.
sometimes, as I like to say, it takes more than one bite of the apple to get it. And
Yeah.
so I never get cynical with somebody. Just because somebody's coming back a third or fourth time, I try to impress on my staff, this could be the time that they're finally ready to go through the transformation that needs to happen.
But
Maybe
they already need to hear praise about the coming back.
yeah, good. All right. How wonderful it is that you're able to give yourself this opportunity and not allow your fear or shame to keep you from accessing treatment.
Yeah, exactly. But that is your beauty, that you have been there. So, and I see that people who don't have the experience are the most judgmental.
Right, right. And you hate to say that, because in the field of addiction treatment, there's this old thing that, you're not supposed to, it was a very Freudian way of never sharing. Being a therapeutic mirror, you weren't really supposed to share your own experience. You were supposed to be a tabula
Aloof. Yeah.
aloof and standoffish. And I was teaching addiction treatment at the university for years, and I had never even shared I used to teach large lecture hall classes. I never had shared that I was also a recovering addict myself. I would keep myself very professionally in my boundaries academically. And finally, my dean said to me, because I wrote my one book where I talked about my addiction, and my dean said to me, Nick, have you ever shared your own personal, you have such amazing insights as a byproduct of your own process. Have you ever shared any of those with your class? And I said, well, of course not, Dean. What? I'm keeping my professional boundaries. I thought she'd give me a pat on the back. And she said, why the hell not? Why are you being so selfish and not sharing what you've learned experientially? And she goes, you're not teaching, physics. You're teaching the treatment of addiction. You have experienced experientially about that, and you're hoarding your wisdom. And I said, oh, I never thought about it that way. I just didn't want to talk about myself. I wanted to talk about, but the other thing is I didn't want to, 90% of my students were not in recovery themselves. They were trying to be therapists and social workers and psychologists. And I didn't want them to think that if they didn't have their own addictive experience, that they couldn't also be of help. Because I know the one woman who really helped me immensely was a therapist who didn't have her own addiction experience, and yet she was empathic and wonderful and well-trained, and she was really helpful. And so there's this idea with addicts that they'll always ask their counselor, have you been there? Are you in recovery? And if you say no, they don't tend to respect you as much. And I didn't want to have well-meaning students feel that they were less than if they weren't also recovering alcoholics and addicts. So that's part of my misguided idea of why I didn't used to share with them about my own experiences, because I thought that would make them feel.
Yeah, it was a noble thought, but my experience is that when you share something of yourself, when you're being authentic, that's really what it's all about. That is what reaches people. Then they hear you really.
That's beautiful. Perfect. That's right. That's right.
And the other way around, you hear more from them also.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said.
And I think it's just about unconditional love.
Yeah. You do have those therapists in my field. Unfortunately, sometimes does have people who have not resolved their own issues, and sometimes enough supervised some of them sometimes, and all they will do is talk about themselves, and then that becomes obviously not productive to the client. Where I remember I had one person who was working for me who was running groups and doing individual therapy, and the complaints from all the clients universally were all that person does is talk about themselves, their problems, their this, and it's not listening.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
that's the other opposite of the spectrum. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Nick, we are almost at the end. I want to give you the opportunity to say something that you haven't said yet, or a message you have for the audience. Your website, you have a website. One is like the title of the book. Let me see here. glowkids.com.
Yeah, and well, my website, probably my main website is www.drkardaris.com, DRKARDARAS.com, and the book is Glow Kids. And I guess my parting message would be to just have parents educate themselves and to encourage them to educate themselves, to be more informed about what their kids are being exposed to in school and in the digital realm. My book, I try to compile as much of the research, over 200 studies, thank you. Over 200 studies are included in my book's bibliography and throughout my book, so parents can make their own informed decisions. I put the research there, and I think the best thing that a parent could do is delay the onset of screens for as long as possible, because prevention is worth an ounce of cure when it comes to screen effects. It's a lot easier to prevent than it is to try to treat after the fact, because I've tried to treat some of those effects after the fact, and it's extremely difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, repairing is more difficult than creating the right way.
Yeah.
In the first go. Yeah. Okay. Well, I had a great time with you. Thank you.
Likewise, you seem like as in the United States we would say you're a good egg. You're a good egg, and it's really great to have met you. And I'm gonna hear some of the things that you said and do some more of my own. I'm going to share with my wife some of the things that you talked a little bit too as well about some of the vaccination effects as well, because we're sensitized to that, but you have a whole wealth of information about that. And I guess at the end of the day, we're all talking about different ways to protect ourselves, to maintain our health from a lot of opposing forces.
Challenges, yes.
Challenges, yes.
Yeah, yeah. I made a clock with in every number compartment 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 things that are endangering us compared to living in the 1700s.
Yeah.
The terror of modern life, I call it.
Yeah, right. Hey, but at least we have an iPhone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, though. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Right.
Kardaris. I love your book. I think it's great that it is here. People can study it. You have a lot of references in it, so people can't say it's not happening. It is, and it's dangerous. Okay, thank you. And thank you, my viewers. Till the next Minority of One report, or the Minority of Two report in this case, of March 12, 2017. Till next time, bye-bye.
If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls bring you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire: the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.